Friends from the media, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2022-23 Budget Press Conference on initiatives under Financial Services and the Treasury Bureau. Let me introduce the guest speakers to you. We have Mr. Christopher Hui, Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury. Ms. Selina Yan, Permanent Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, Financial Services. Ms. Kathy Chu, Permanent Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, Treasury. Mr. Tam Pan, Commissioner of Inland Revenue. Mr. Kevin Siu, Commissioner of Rating and Valuation, as well as Mr. Raymond Lee, CEO of Hong Kong Mortgage Corporation Limited. The Secretary will say a few words before he takes questions. Thank you. Friends from the media, fellow citizens, good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here to brief you on our initiatives. In the latest budget, I prepared a PPT to assist my presentation. As regards financial services, now we will have various supporting measures and talent nurturing treasures to seize these new opportunities. We are going to consolidate our advantages in asset and wealth management and to strengthen our role as an offshore renminbi business hub to contribute to the country's internationalization of renminbi business is in the far left-hand side of the paper. And then in the middle, we have Treasury Initiatives. We've already reviewed our rating system, and we have raised concession arrangements, and we're going to implement PREPS 2.0, and therefore we have the Commissioner of Inland Revenue present. The epidemic has dealt a blow to people's livelihood and our economy, so we have some relief measures. To develop fintech, we need entrepreneurship spirit, and so we have got the POC subsidies scheme. It was well received last year. We proposed to allocate another $10 million to support a new round of POC subsidy scheme and to provide solutions to remove development bottlenecks faced by the fintech industry. And Hong Kong MA and the People's Bank of China will develop a one-stop platform in the form of a network lineup to allow eligible financial institutions and technology firms to conduct pilot trials, and we will also consider enriching the functions of commercial data interchange, so the financial institutions with authorization by enterprises can obtain enterprises' data kept in government departments. And then to leverage the new market opportunities, we have to develop green and sustainable finance. We've already issued $7 billion equivalent of government green bonds, and will continue to issue green bonds totaling about $4.5 billion equivalent this year. We will support SMEs to join this market with great potential. So last year, we launched the Green and Sustainable Finance Grant Scheme, and the minimum loan size was $200 million last year. We're going to lower that to $100 million to lower the threshold for participation. To grasp these opportunities to enrich our financial talent pool, we are going to launch various schemes to train and help the trained personnel to obtain the necessary qualifications. We are going to set up a qualification frameworks for fintech practitioners, so much so for financing financial talent pool and seizing the emerging market opportunities. And then we'll also consolidate our strengths for further development. Our securities market have made a great improvement in terms of trading and also transaction volume. And this has contributed to our development. And the Hong Kong Act has reviewed the listing rules to allow pre-profit, pre-trading companies to be listed in Hong Kong in order to be prepared for the return of China concept stocks. We'd like to strike a balance between regulation and development, so we have introduced the SPAC regime. Now, we would like to amend our listing rules for meeting the fundraising needs of large-scale advanced technology enterprises which require substantial capital for their R&D work, but not yet making profit and trading record requirements. Now, for mutual market access with various rounds of deepening, it is shown that this is a very potential, a big market. This is an area of great market potential, and we're going to implement the ETF Connect as soon as possible. To be an all-round financial center, we must put emphasis on our bond market as well. So we have taken on board suggestions from the Steering Committee on Bond Market Development. We're going to expand the issuance of green renminbi and longer-term Hong Kong dollar bonds. We encourage participation of mainland enterprises and entities in Hong Kong's bond market. We will enhance the functions of the central money markets unit and develop an electronic bond trading platform. And this will provide more investment choices for retail investors. We will consider enhancing the prospective requirements to facilitate the participation by retail investors. We will issue no less than $15 billion of I-bond, $35 billion of silver bond, and $10 billion of retail green bond to capitalize on BNI. We are going to offer infrastructure financing securitization products with a total value of $150 million to investors. So Raymond will elaborate later. And we'll also try to attract family offices to operate in Hong Kong. We will provide tax concessions for eligible family investment management entities, and will consult the trade as soon as possible. The FS has announced that there will be an increased allocation of $10 billion to the Hong Kong Growth Pavilion, and about $5 billion will be for a Greater Bay Area Investment Fund to develop industries where we have an advantage, and that will also bring economic opportunities for us. As for renminbi business, we'll continue to strengthen our role as an offshore renminbi business hub, and we will enhance in the following three areas. Now, stocks of southbound Stock Connect will be denominated in renminbi because the feasibility study has been completed, and will discuss with main authorities and related institutions. Will engage issuers and market participants, and will have supporting measures such as waiving the stamp duty on stock transfers paid by market makers in their transactions. Another area is to enrich offerings of offshore renminbi products. So we will provide more diversified renminbi wealth management products and bonds in Hong Kong. We'll also explore with many authorities enhancement measures to enhance cross-boundary wealth management connect that could include increasing quotas gradually, expanding the scope of eligible investment products, and include more participants, and provide and improving the distribution arrangement. Now, we have also reviewed our rating system. We have got two suggestions. To better reflect the affordable users pay principle and to enhance government revenue, we propose to introduce a progressive rating system for domestic properties. Under the current proposals, about 2.2% of our total private domestic properties will be affected. We have set out examples of how properties of different value will be affected under the new system. The second proposal is to amend our rates concession system, and that will be done in a more targeted manner. Now, to respond to public concerns over the multiple rates concessions received by owners with multiple domestic properties under the current mechanism, we propose that only eligible owners who are natural persons can apply for race concession for one domestic property under the name, to be more focused in providing concessions. And then we can also consider the extent of rates concession in the future. And then we've also got a PPT here to show you the amount and the effective date and application date.
In relation to BEPS 2.0 and the timetable, there are two pillars under BEPS 2.0. The first one is the allocation of taxing rights in respect of residual profits of mega multinational enterprise and also large MNE groups. We will be adhering to the principles shown here on the PPT. We will keep the territorial resource principle and maintain the simple and certain transparent tax regime. And we will be submitting legislative proposals in 2022 for implementation in 2023 and implement domestic minimum top-up tax from 2024. In order to alleviate people's hardship and supporting enterprises, we provide the salaries tax rebate and raise concession and also electricity account subsidy. Other than that, we also provide the 100% loan guarantee scheme and also the arrangement for tax concession in respect of rental expenses. And we also have the arrangement of rent enforcement moratorium to alleviate the plight of the SMEs. Let me go into greater detail here. In terms of the tax deduction for domestic rental expenses, the idea is to ease the burden of renting a private property on taxpayers who are not owners. About 430,000 taxpayers will benefit. The revenue foregone will amount to $3.3 billion per year. First, there will be a deduction, a ceiling of $100,000 for each year of assessment. Second, the rental private property must be taxpayers' principal residence, and if there is more than one tenant, deduction ceiling is to be reduced in proportion to the number of co-tenants, and also the rented property must be the taxpayer's principal place of residence, and the tenancy agreement must be a stamped one.
咁財政司司長喺去年宣布咗設立呢個100%擔保個人特惠貸款
The FS announced the supplementary measure of 100% personal loan guarantee scheme. Given the latest wave of COVID's impact on different sectors, we propose to extend this by 1 year and also optimize the terms. And the maximum loan amount will be increased, and the repayment period and the principal moratorium duration will be lengthened. That's it from me for the time being. I welcome questions from the floor. Please raise your hands, please wait for the mic, and also please identify the organizations you work for. The one in black over here, please.
局長你好 ，Now TV
Secretary Now TV.
第一咧就想問下關於嗰個消費券嗰度啦，
即係
其實市民簽下咗個報告，即係預算案1日之後咧，其實即係普遍都無論係業界定係啲市民咧，其實都冇話好大嘅掌聲對於再
and there doesn't seem to be a lot of applause for the consumption voucher scheme. People seem to get the feeling that cash would be more practicable. And also the administrative charge for this scheme, it was said last time there was to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, if the administrative cost is so high, why do you still have to insist on the electronic voucher scheme instead of cash? And also the moratorium on rent enforcement. Now, why is it that the government is legitimizing the delay in rent payment? The property sector is of the view that the government should subsidize their losses. The economic situation is very bad, and they have mortgaged their property to the bank, and they have reached the mortgage payment, and they cannot collect any rental. How is the government going to deal with this? And also the tax concession for rental expenses. People can save about $10,000 for 6 months, and it doesn't go a long way to helping people significantly. And this measure will not do anything to the market. It seems to be a symbolic gesture. Right, 3 questions there. First of all, the consumption voucher scheme. Now, this is one of the budget measures. I think we have to look at it holistically. We do have other one-off concessions in terms of tax rates and so on. And this is a broad scheme covering a broad spectrum of people. Second, in terms of the timing, you may feel that there may be some other measures that would be considered better. Now, this is not the first time we introduced the consumption vouchers. We are having regard to the economic situation, the severe pandemic situation. We'd like to have some timely relief. So we work on the basis of the data we have and make available the voucher in April. If we have to do it all over again, it might take an awful long time. Also, regarding the consumption vouchers, now we are presenting all these measures holistically. There are so many fine details, and so please be a little bit more patient. We will present a broader picture to you. You mentioned the rental enforcement moratorium. This is not a first in Hong Kong. If you cast aside to other places, Singapore and the UK, for example, the idea is given the COVID, many tenants may suffer from cash flow problem, but they cannot meet the rental payment, and they would like to have a bit of a hiatus for, let's say, 3 months for them to have a breathing space for them to talk with the landlord, for them to tie them over the difficulties. Now, with any contract, there are 2 parties. Now, here we have the landlord and the tenant. The landlords may not be really big landlords. But if you look at our intention, the beneficiaries are basically, in our thinking, under 599F, all these scheduled premises, the gyms, the game center, beauty parlors, karaoke parlors, and the F&B premises, childcare center, kindergartens, retail premises, and also travel agents, employment agencies, and some of these are the beneficiaries. We'd like to cover the sectors that are affected by the pandemic. We're not encouraging confrontation. We hope that in this process there will be accommodation, and the landlord and the tenants can get into discussion to get over the difficulties. You've got a point there. In some cases, the landlords may have a mortgage, and the commercial premises
屋咧，或
that
者
they
個地
own
方咧，其實係做緊呢個再融資嘅嚇。
Um,
咁所以呢一方面咧，其實我哋都同呢個金管局咧係跟
under
進緊，
a
即係可
finance
唔可以咧通過
scheme,
咧同銀行
and
協
we
商
are
咧，希
liaising
望有
with
達成處
the
所
Hong
以呢
Kong
個成
MA,
個價值鏈咧，其實方方
and
面
they will
面
be
有唔
discussing
同
with
嘅
the
呢個咁嘅
the landlords.
個體或者係機構咧，其實都需要咧係
So
一齊協
these
商同
we
埋
have
處理
to
嘅
have a mutual
咁第三個問題
discussion
啦，就係關於
to work out
嗰個稅
work
務即
things
係個
out.
租金底面嗰個。
As
其實
regards
如果大家記得咧，就
the
係我哋目
tax
前都有一個
deduction
類
for
似
domestic
嘅一個抵
rental
扣安排，
expenses, we
就
do
係
have
如果
similar
係你
arrangement
用
as of
呢個
now.
銀行按揭
If you
即係
take
10
out
萬蚊
a
嘅利息
mortgage
可以做抵扣個
and
稅嘅安排。
the
所以今次咧，其實咧係
$100,000 of
可以同另
mortgage
一方面
payment can be
你
offset
買樓嘅
against
時候
your tax
做按揭
liability.
有10萬蚊嘅利息嘅抵扣，而今次咧就係如
Now
果係租
here,
嘅話咧，就係呢個
with
10萬
regard
蚊
to
嘅
a
呢個
rental,
呢個租金
you
嘅
have
抵扣。咁
the
所以其實都係體
offsetting
現翻咧，就
to the
係
tune
話
of
希望喺呢個過程入邊
$100,000.
係令到
We hope
係
that
呢
in
個無
this
論你係業主也
process,
好，
whether you
或
are
者你
the
係呢個
landlord
租客都好
or
咧，
whether you
係有
are
一定嘅寬免。
the
同埋
tenant,
如
there
果
will
係
be
要整全
certain
咁睇成套呢個預算案，
waiving
其實我
arrangement.
哋
If you
喺
look
多
at
方
the
面
budget
都係希望咧
holistically,
係能夠喺呢個時候咧係
we
可以
are
幫到咧
are
成個
trying
經
to
濟嘅
help
市民。咁所以
the
咧係應該
residents
單止係
as best we
呢
can.
個咁嘅措施嚟睇，應該
So
去
we
整
should
體
not single out any particular measure. We have to look at it holistically.
Next,
後排中間黑色外套嗰位女士。
the lady in the black jacket.
喂，係你好，係Cable 記
Good
者。
afternoon,
首先
I'm
咧
from
都係想
Cable
問翻即係
TV.
禁止業主追租方面咧，即係各方會預期
Regarding
到會
the
有
rental
租霸咧
enforcement
刻意拖
moratorium,
半交租
do you think there may
即
be
係會唔會有啲
tenants who
數字咁樣咧
deliberately
坊
default
間
in
有
rent
意見覺
payment
得
and
政
then
府係
wind up
即係
their
要
businesses
業主為
afterwards?
佢哋嘅即係
And
措
the
施埋單啊，
community
各
has
方
the
又
view
點
that you're
睇呢一個
asking
講法
landlords
咧？
to pay
另
for
外
your
同埋都
measures.
見到即係
What
政
is
府
your
就
view
即係
on
有
this
要求到
comment?
銀行做啲彈性嘅處
And
理
then
啦。點解唔
banks
一
are also
併禁止即係
required
銀行
to
做一個追
exercise
討嘅行為
flexibility.
咧？即係
Why
都係
don't
保
you
護第三個業主
have
即係當中
a
涉及啲咩
moratorium
考慮因
for
素咧？咁如果
bank
銀行
action
即係
as
而家
well?
呢個
What are the
情況下可以照
considerations?
追討咧？
In
即係
fact,
如果佢照追討
banks
嘅話，
can
其實會唔會
continue
有
to
啲
ask
罰則
for
咁樣咧？
mortgage repayment, and if they do so, will there be any
係其
penalty?
實你嗰個核心問題咧，我覺得
I
都係牽
think
涉到即係
The crux of your
業主同租戶
question
租客之間嘅關係啦，可以咁講。
is
咁
the
其實
landlord
佢哋兩者
tenant
之間嗰個利益咧
relations.
唔係完全對立嘅。
I
亦都唔
think
係一定係一個零
the
和遊戲
interests are not
因為
necessarily
例如係有個地方
adversarial,
你
and this is not really a
租客
zero-sum
因為
game.
執笠或者因為咧
Now, if the
係做唔到落
tenant
去佢冇租。
has to wind up his business, I think there will be impact on the landlord as well. So if because of short-term cash flow problem, if the tenants can find some relief under our moratorium, this will be an opportunity for the landlord and tenant to negotiate, to, for instance, have some transitional arrangements. On one hand, the landlord can keep his tenant. On the other, when the tenant's business improves later, he can continue to pay rent. So this is a win-win situation. And of course, there are different landlords and tenants are in different circumstances, and hopefully this measure can help operators with a short-term cash flow problem because of the epidemic. Hopefully, there can be a negotiation between landlords and tenants so that they can ride out the difficulty together.
呢位灰色衫嗰位男士。
This gentleman in a grey jacket.
局長你好，明報嘅。我
I'm
有
from
幾
Ming
個
Pao.
問題咧，
Good
關於嗰
afternoon.
即係個 moratorium，
I've got a few questions
限制
related to the rental enforcement
第一咧，我都想
moratorium.
關注下嗰個立法
First,
嘅方式嘅。
I'd like to know the mode of legislation.
政府嘅計劃咧，諗住週五就罕見嘅。
There
咁其實
are
係咪即係諗住用
rumors
嗰個
that
先訂
the
立後審
government
議嘅
will
方法咧，
gazette
同埋
this
其實佢都係
moratorium
改
this
緊啲
Friday.
法例同
So
埋
it
引用
will
緊啲法例
it be
做，即係
by
譬如係咪
means of
緊急法咧咁樣。
negative
呢個第一。
vetting?
第
Under
二咧就
what
係嗰
principle
個
ordinance are you
即係
going to
嗰個仲
legislate?
裁
Will
嗰
it
個
be
機制
under
咧，
the
即係如果即係
emergency
出現咗
regulation
問題咧，
ordinance?
即係或者有進一步嘅爭
And
議咧，係
should
會
there be
點
a
樣去
further
解決即係邊一
dispute
個
between the landlord
去
and
做嗰個
tenant?
arbiter
Who
去處理咧，定係佢
will
anyway 都
be
要
the
去翻法庭
arbitrator?
去處理咧？
Will
呢個第二。
the case have to be
第三咧
dealt
就係嗰個我
in
見
court?
即係你哋一直都引述咧，就用嗰個表列處所啦。
Now
咁咧
you
表列
have
處所
been
入邊咧，即係
referring
最近嗰
to
個修訂
the
咧，就 F 個
scheduled
修訂咧，
premises,
其實包
but
括
in
即
the
係商
recent
場啊、超
amendment
市
to
嘅。
Cap
咁其實會唔會
599F,
某程度上咧喺
supermarkets
即係
and
即係好心
shopping
做壞
malls
事咧，就可能一啲
are
大業主或者
included.
大租戶咧，
your well-intention may be counterproductive with major landlords benefit ultimately. For instance, will you set out the size of the shops concerned? Now, in other countries, under a similar moratorium arrangement, they provide subsidies to the landlord. So is the government going to do the same? Now, regarding a sunset clause, it is said by the administration that you hope that the moratorium can last for 3 to 6 months, assuming that the epidemic has a turn for the worse. So will you reactivate this moratorium, or will you extend the scope of the moratorium to cover other types of premises and even buildings?
首先呢一個成個嗰個構思咧，一定係非常時期嘅措施嚟。
Of course, the whole measure is an exceptional measure during exceptional times. So we will focus on scheduled premises in CAP 599F, for instance, travel agencies, childcare centres, and catering establishments, etc. Secondly, this will be a new piece of legislation that will not be amending an existing legislation. And the intention of the move is to use this as a tool to enable landlords and tenants to negotiate and to ride out this difficult period with goodwill. P.S. As said by the Secretary, this is going to be a new piece of legislation. As regards premises involved, in our Gazetto, we will set out premises covered. They will include scheduled premises under CAP 599F and some premises assisted under the Anti-Epidemic Fund. So the scope is industry-based, and only such specific sectors will be covered by the legislation. Speaker is off mic. Well, examples. As explained to you, we will include beauty parlors, massage parlors, and hairdressing salons and amusement games centers. There are quite a number of scheduled premises included. So, if you're interested in this topic, we can provide you with more information because it's hard to give you an exhaustive list. Besides, we want to be exact and accurate. The speaker is off mic. Regarding the size of the premises concerned, this is not our consideration. We'd like to consider scheduled premises under CAP 599F. So it's got nothing to do with the size of the premises concerned. Next, the lady in black.
Questions from the South China Morning Post. My questions will revolve around the rental moratorium. So you've already mentioned that the businesses covered will be subject to the 599F, but is there any difference with regard to the type of property? Is it going to cover retail, commercial, or both? And will there be any cap size on the monthly rent? And when would this moratorium start date begin? It was suggested this morning that it could start from January 1st this year, or how will that pan out in terms of the timeline? A second question is, what happens if the SMEs cannot pay back the rent with the duration of the moratorium in force? If there are any disputes, how will the arbitration move forward? And why didn't the government consider any other alternatives such as rent controls for these types of properties or any subsidies to SMEs to cover their rent during the period? I have one question about retail green bonds. So $10 billion in green bonds will be issued. Can the government sort of clarify where it intends to use the funds? Will it cover any new sustainability projects in the pipeline?
I'll answer your second question first, and then the first one. And regarding the green bonds, in fact, there's very detailed disclosure every year in terms of how we spend the proceeds. So far, we have issued 2 reports on green bonds and highlighting the different projects that we apply those green bond proceeds. We are amounting to around like $7 billion. So it's something that's accessible and also readily available to everybody. And on your first question regarding the moratorium, I think right now, as highlighted and I answered just now, basically the scope to apply this moratorium will be listed in detail in the law. And because right now it is indeed the contents of the law is being contemplated internally in terms of going through an internal process. And that's why once this details are confirmed, we will have it go through the normal process for publication in order to seek wider views of electrical. Because after all, this is a new legislation and we need electrical's approval to make it possible. And at the same time, you asked about the alternative means other than using moratorium to help the tenants. Because after all, it is a balancing act. Because if you look at how other jurisdictions are doing it, some of them opt this one, because after all, it is short-term, as highlighted in the title of the proposed legislation. And at the same time, it really gives some leeway for both tenants and the landlords to sit down and to see how can they structure the financial liabilities of the landlord, of the tenant, in such a way that they can together ride through this rather difficult period. And I do reckon, as highlighted by some of the previous questions, that it's, after all, not just a landlord-tenant matter. It may involve banks and also some other enterprises. And that's why there needs to be a better coordination in terms of how this whole thing can better serve the objective that we seek out to meet. So can you repeat once again? I can't hear.
How will you balance the law to benefit both the landlords and the tenants? And what happens if the tenant cannot pay up after the moratorium period or after the grace period, so to say? And will this arrangement sort of like disrupt the rental market of such properties?
This law is not meant to disrupt the property market or the rental market. And after all, the interests of both the landlord and the tenant are not mutually exclusive. Because after all, from the landlord perspective, if the tenant is still there, it's just that they're undergoing some short-term cash flow issues, not being able to pay up the rent for the time being, then the continued existence of the tenancy agreement may continuously help to facilitate each other to ride through these current economic difficulties and to allow the tenant to revive its business going forward. When the business comes back, then it may be able to pay up the rent. Because after all, in terms of the landlord itself, it may also incur extra cost if they need to find another tenant. At the same time, whether they can get another tenant is also a potential unknown. And so from the landlord perspective, having the tenant there, yet at the same time, with this law in place to facilitate them to ride through this difficult period, can potentially be a plus. And from a tenant perspective, I think it's obvious that when they are undergoing this short-term cash flow issue, then with this moratorium, then they may be able to relieve some of their short-term burdens on their finances and able to pick themselves up going forward when the COVID situation improves. So after all, this is a mechanism that we intend to put out in such a way that the landlord and the tenant can sit together and to see how they can work this out together.
下一條，呢邊。
Next question. third row there. RTHK.
首先係一個放寬個樓按問題。
First of all, the relaxation of the loan to value ratio for the mortgage. Some said that some landlords are jacking up prices immediately. The government is trying to give more options to the people, but would there be any effective outcome that the government will be shoring up the market, making it difficult for people to go on the housing ladder? Is it the case that the government is launching these measures because the market is dipping? Also, the moratorium, if there are some difficulties with regard to the landlords, the HKMA will be talking to the banks, but if we're talking about small-time landlords, if they fail to collect the rent for 3 months, then it would have significant bearing on their own livelihood. Will there be any supplementary measures to assist them? Third, the situation with regard to Ukraine, it is pretty tense. Now, has the government assessed the European geopolitics? How is it going to be impacting on Hong Kong's economy in the near and medium term? Right, a couple of things there. Let me address this. About the economy, that's the last question. The immediate challenge is COVID, so it's our priority to tackle the pandemic for us to reboot the economy. We have been analyzing with our economists as to how we should tackle the immediate issue. Obviously, is the pandemic. That's our number one priority. You referred also to the financial market. It has been developing pretty steadily. Now, you talked about the housing market. If you look at the increase from $10 billion to $12 billion, this is not the first time we've done it. The profit market has been pretty stable. We've heard some feedback from the members of the public. Some feel that for those who are already in the housing market, they like to improve their living conditions, they like to trade up. And there may be some professionals who told us that it is difficult for them to get on the housing ladder. Now, we're launching this not because we want to shore up the market, but because we want to offer assistance to people who want to improve the quality of life and also for those who want to get on the housing ladder. Over here, please.
Mr. Hui, I'm from RTHK. I just want to follow up on the rent moratorium. And will the government consider any subsidy to the landlords because they have complained that they're also suffering during the pandemic? And also earlier, your colleague mentioned that there will be no restriction on the size of the premises. So would that also benefit businesses like supermarkets that are not so much affected by the pandemic? Thank you.
I think you raise a question regarding the subsidies that the government is providing in this budget. I think we need to look at this holistically because right now, if you look at the counter-cyclical measures as set out in the budget, basically, if you try to divide them across 3 dimensions, those targeting individuals, those targeting corporates, and those relating to like guarantees, but not really a cash handout, but a guarantees provided by government. Basically, the total size is amounting to 170 billion Hong Kong dollars, and of which, basically for individuals, we are talking about 98 billion, and for corporates, not the guarantees, but the corporates, we are talking about around like 11 billion. And for the rest, it's around like 62 billion is amounting to the guarantees that we provide under various schemes. So after all, I think it's not very, it's more constructive, not just to single out this arrangement and say that it's not helpful to the overall economy. Because after all, we need to see things in their entirety as a whole package. That's number one. And number two, I think in terms of the subsidies that you are contemplating, and the difference from this proposed scheme is that right now, this arrangement basically is not about the government giving out money, but more an arrangement in such a way that there will be a standstill arrangement in such a way that some breathing space can be given to the tenant at this time of difficult period economically, and for them to discuss, and also at the same time for landlord to reach out to them in such a way that they can sit down together and work this out. So after all, even though there could be a short-term issue, as you highlighted, but at the same time, I think it's rather, as highlighted in the name of this legislation, it is a short-term protection measure. We are talking about 3 months as a start. And also at the same time, we are not the first country or jurisdiction to do that. And basically, some other jurisdictions are following similar examples to do that in order to provide temporary relief. That's why we are proposing this, and of course, this is subject to debate and also discussion through a regular and also normal legislative process.
仲有冇其他提問？
Any other questions?
邊邊？
Yes?
局長你好，星島旗。
Good afternoon, Secretary. I'm from Singtao. I'd like to cover other topics. Now you're going to amend the listing rules so that pre-revenue, pre-profit in technology enterprises can be listed. I'd like to know how do you define advanced technology enterprises? We've asked the industry, and the speculation is AI or chip manufacturing technology and focused and very high-tech and advanced industries. Will you be competing for business with the other exchanges in the mainland?
另外就係想問多少少關於港股通人民幣計價嗰度啦。
Regarding renminbi denominated stock connect.
嗰個交投都比較低啦。
In fact, the current trading volume is limited, so I'd like to know how useful is it for you to introduce this new arrangement? And it is said that you're going to introduce special arrangement to deal with hedging. So can you tell us a little bit more about this market maker opportunity? Will it be similar to the market maker mechanism for futures and
兩個問題咧，咁我先答咗嗰個上市嘅問題。關於上市嗰度咧，其實今次嗰個預算案都提出咧，就係我哋希望咧係能夠去考慮一啲先進技術同埋大規模嘅科技企業。咁其實睇翻我哋過去嘅嗰個生物科技嘅改革咧，因為大家知道咧，相對於生物科技而言咧，因為生物科技可能佢哋喺佢嘅業務發展或者研發方面咧。係有一啲嘅里程碑，例如一啲臨床嘅試驗啊，或者一啲嘅測試等等一啲比較客觀嘅數據嚟。咁但係呢啲科技今日講係冇國界分嘅，即係基本上頭先你講嗰啲例如係先進技術或者其他方面咧，都係一啲所謂科技或者先進科技囊括嘅部分。咁所以點解我哋需要咧係去諗一套
included in advanced technology, and that's why we want to provide for this kind of enterprises because they need a
或者投入以外咧，其實唔係能夠好快咁有個盈利，或者有業績嘅。咁所以呢一個咧係需要咧係有個平衡喺度。
Profit very quickly, and it may not be easy for them to have their profit to support listing. And as for renminbi denominated products, we have about 100 of them. We've got ETF and bonds as well as stocks, although the number is not that many. Why do we support the southbound connect? Because the demand is clear. Because the investors have renminbi. They want to use renminbi. They have to invest in Hong Kong stocks. And this is a facilitation measure so that they don't have to do any exchange, and they do not have to suffer because of change in exchange rate. You asked a question about market makers. Now, when we have Stock Connect to be denominated in RMB in the future, then we will have both renminbi denominated and Hong Kong dollar denominated stocks. In an ideal world, I hope the prices will be the same, but in reality, there might be some friction. So market makers can help both types. So we want to provide stamp duty waiver on stock transfers paid by market makers so that they can enhance their role in this regard. Last question, please.
或者明報或者記者朋友嚇，因為剛才你有問過即係嗰個處所包含啦，咁因為
You asked about the scope of premises. There are many premises under Cap 599F, and I said I could provide you with the information later. Apart from premises under Cap 599F, there are 17 more, and they are catering establishments, childcare centers, kindergartens, private primary and secondary day schools, and retail outlets, tutorial schools, premises offering interest classes, and travel agencies, cruise and employment agencies, concert organizers, caterers for schools, and fresh provision shops, performing premises for the operation of arts, of performing arts groups. So these sectors will be covered in addition to those already included in Cap 599F. I'm from Hong Kong 01. There are interest hikes in the US, and the global environment is rather unstable. If at this moment you relax the mortgage rate, you making a trap for our young people. And do you know how many people will be eligible to become homeowners? And some economists are saying that the consumption voucher is just to cover up for the poor work done by the administration in controlling the epidemic, and this is not to be encouraged. What's your comment on that? This is already the second time we issue consumption vouchers, and our position is very clear, is to relieve people's hardship. By issuing extensively consumption vouchers, we hope that our residents can then have some money to spend, and at the same time, we want to achieve a multiplying effect to boost the economy. In the last round of issuing consumption vouchers, we achieved a few things. First, electronic consumption is now more common. I've visited markets. Some markets have installed electronic payment devices with the assistance of FEHD, and because of the electronic consumption vouchers, now people use electronic payment system more often. And secondly, there were a few electronic payment devices suppliers, and they competed with one another. So we use government resources to promote beneficial competition among the operators. And I think ultimately members of the public have benefited, and that's why we have proposed another round of consumption vouchers. The last question, AM 730. And regarding tax deduction for domestic rental expenses, is there any definition for a joint tenants? Now, for parents and a parent and children is not allowed. What about in-laws? Is there any definition? And as for the rental enforcement moratorium, eventually, tenants still have to pay rent. So will this moratorium leading to a build-up of debts? So after 3 months of moratorium, the rent in arrears may have built up, and that will increase the pressure for them to wind up their business. All right, I'll take the first and second questions, and the legal definition, I will invite the Commissioner of Inland Revenue to answer.
Well, you mentioned the short-term protection measures for the tenants. We're talking about a short-term period of 3 months. And our intent is that in many cases, the landlords and the tenants would have some room to discuss the matters in a mutually beneficial way. I mentioned the mutual benefits. The benefits do not have to be a zero-sum game. They do not have to be exclusive. We like to have short-term leeway in a way that the tenants who suffer from short-term cash flow problems and are unable to meet the rental payment will be able to come up with some arrangements whereby the landlord will keep the tenant and hope that the rent will be paid when the situation turns around, and also that would be beneficial to the tenants in that when the pandemic is over, it will be able to continue with the business. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Under the Inland Revenue Ordinance, there are provisions regarding the associates, and in many cases, the associates include spouses, parents, siblings, partners, or an entity controlled by the relevant people. Now, these tax deduction for domestic rental expenses will be implemented by way of legislative amendment of the IRO, and the definition of associates will be written into the law, and we get to see the detailed definition by then. Thank you all very much. That's it for the press conference.